Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Becoming Chiron, the key to unlocking healing and personal alchemy. I am your hostess, Ursula Duffy, and this is episode 8. And I am recording this on Wednesday, August 17th, and I just pushed the button at 1:31 p.m. here in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And today we're going to be talking about, or I'm going to be sharing the story of my Saturn return. Last episode, I shared the story of my current experience going through my Uranus opposition. And in order to really dive deep into the experience, it's very worthwhile to go back to other very important transits. So being that I'm 41, the transit that I went through, that was a huge deal before this one, which is also a huge deal, as I've already shared, was my Saturn return. We all go through Saturn returns. Some of us can experience 3 or more if we live to 120 years old, but generally they occur every 27 to 30 years. So the first one being around when age 27. And it's usually a time of really diving deep into adulting. At least the first one is. The second one, I've worked with clients who were going through their second one, and that experience is a little bit different. First one, and I can tell you, based on my personal experience, is very, very much about adulting. So we're going to get into all of that. But first, I want to share the astro weather check, as we always do. So today we have the moon waning through Taurus, and it's approaching that final third quarter square phase. So we had that beautiful, energetic new moon in Leo at the end of July. And we just had the full moon last week on Thursday, on August 11th, I believe it was. And that was a pretty intense full moon. I shared a lot about that. If you want to go back and listen to our Spirit Speaks episode on the Sea Goddess Healing Arts YouTube channel, which we recorded last week on Monday, I share a lot about the grittiness of that full moon and the squares that were involved in all of that. So the energy has shifted a bit. It should feel a little bit more chill now. We have Mars at the very end of the sign of Taurus. And I'm going to circle back to Mars in a moment. We still have Uranus and the North Node tagging along very closely together in Taurus. I talked about that last time. And we have Mercury now in Virgo. So it should feel a little bit more organized. If you're feeling the need to get organized, or your mind is a little bit sharper right now, or detail oriented, that's probably what you're feeling, is Mercury in Virgo. Mercury is whipping through now and is in the evening sky, getting very close to the next retrograde cycle, which will start on September 9th. And I'll share a little bit more about that at the end. We have Venus now in the sign of Leo, approaching the part of her cycle where she's traveling on the opposite side of the sun. So Venus will very quickly in the near future become invisible to us for a while. I don't like those times, considering how important Venus is in my chart. I don't like when we can't see her. She just feels so far away. This is the farthest away she gets from us. So you might be feeling that a little bit too, like a fleeting feeling in relationships or your connections or anything like that. That's probably what you're feeling. We still have the sun in Leo. Virgo season will begin very soon, next week. And to circle back now to Mars, the big thing that's coming up next week as well, I believe it's on the 19th, Mars will ingress into the sign of Gemini, which is where Mars's next retrograde will be starting in the fall. Mars will be in the sign of Gemini for roughly 6 or 7 months. Whenever Mars goes retrograde, we typically experience this. This happened last time. Mars retrogrades are every 2 years. This happened last time in 2020 in the sign of Aries. Mars spent a very extended period in the sign of Aries during that time. I believe that was also roughly 6 months. You can go to my blog and read all about that. I have a very intricately written blog post about that on ursalchemy.com. So this one I'm percolating. It's going to be interesting. If you use whole sign like I do, that means that Mars will be in that house of yours for roughly 6 months. For me personally, it's going to be my second, so I'm very interested to see what's going to happen there. Second house is our values and our resources, but also our self-confidence. And we're going to talk about self-confidence a little bit too when I share my Saturn return experience. So we shall see. It's going to make some interesting aspects to other planets during this time. I love Mars retrogrades in particular because of the visuals that we get. Mars is super big in the sky and like really red, and it gets really, really cool, especially at the peak of it, which will be in early December when Mars is opposite the sun. So that is, it's like, I think it's called, it's midnight star phase. So you look up in the middle of the night and Mars is just like giant and red. So that's always a really cool experience as part of the retrograde. So I'll get more into the Mars retrograde eventually. I believe we're going to do a special class on it at Sea Goddess in early December. So stay tuned for that. We'll be talking all about it, but just know that the ingress is coming in the next couple of days, and just, just pay close attention. If you know your chart, where your Gemini house is, if you use whole sign, just pay attention to what's kind of percolating and happening, and you're going to have a long time to figure out what the experience is going to be all about. So just a note also, if you have planets in mutable signs, so that would be Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces, Mars will be making aspects to those planets that you have natally as well. So that will flavor the experience for sure on a personal level. And then there's always a collective experience too. So we shall see. It's going to be a very interesting fall with Mercury retrograde, Mars retrograde, Venus being invisible. And we'll have the next round of eclipses coming in the fall as well in Scorpio and Taurus. So buckle up. But as always, I am here to guide you. I'll be sharing these astro weather forecasts continually at the beginning of every episode, and then I'm sure we'll be talking about it on Sea Goddess Healing Arts YouTube as well, and our individual shows, as well as maybe some specials we'll do, and then definitely our classes. Reaping the Rewards of Retrograde will be back starting mid-September, so be on the lookout for that. That's already up on our website, and registration is already open. So that's the series that we do with every Mercury retrograde, which is awesome. So you can go to our classes page for that, seagoddesshealingarts.com/classes. And I feel at this point I'm now deflecting and avoiding getting into my Saturn return experience share. So let's just dive right into it. I'm going to pull up my chart. If you're familiar with astrology, this will definitely give you a lot of insight into what this experience was for me. And it was an incredible healing journey. I did not, as I've shared, know about astrology at this time. I wish I had, because I think I probably would have handled the experience in a more mature way, or a more evolved way, I guess is the best way I can put it. Because as I've shared, my Uranus opposition experience is on steroids, or extremely amplified, as it's happening with Uranus going through my first house. With my Saturn return experience, I incarnated with another equally interesting setup, and I went through something that not everybody experiences, which is I went through what's called Sade Sati at the same time as my Saturn return. So what that means is Sade Sati is when Saturn transits the house before, of, and after your natal moon. So just to recap on my chart, to give you an idea of what this whole thing was about and the houses for me that it was involving, I have my nodal axis is 10 and 4, Leo and Aquarius. So I have my north node in my 4th house in Leo, and my south node in my 10th house in Aquarius at 17 degrees. My 5th house is my Virgo house, and that contains my Venus, as I've shared, at 2 degrees of Virgo, my moon at 20 degrees of Virgo, and Jupiter at 25 degrees of Virgo. My 6th house is my Libra house, and there I have Saturn at 1 degree, my Sun at 13 degrees, and Pluto at 21 degrees. As I've said in past episodes, I have a lot of clusters in my chart. These fit 5, 6, and 7 are my cluster houses, my stellium houses, if you will. And that means that during my Saturn return experience and during this whole experience with Sade Sati being concurrent, Saturn was transiting several of my natal planets. And that certainly made this experience incredibly more intense than probably most people go through. It's said that when you are born at night, there's a Hellenistic astrology themes, concepts around this, that the Saturn's a more difficult and challenging planet when you're born at night. Thankfully, I have Saturn in Libra, which is said to be exalted. However, I also have a Libra sun, which is not so much exalted. The sun is said to be exalted in the sign of Aries. So whenever we have an exaltation, the opposite sign is where a planet is said to be in quote unquote fall. I've mentioned I hate that word for it, but it's descriptive and it does the job. So with Aries, the focus is on the individual and, you know, yourself and being your individual self and shining that light out in the world. And in Libra, it's more focused on partnerships and other people. And that was also a huge part of this experience for me. If you want to learn more about Sade Sati, which is really, and I guess the best way I can put it, I actually have notes here. Let me pull them up real quick, because I feel like this describes it very, very well. It's a time of emotional maturity. When we talk about Saturn, we're talking about boundaries and responsibility and reality and our sense of personal authority. We are looking at the planet that is the last visible planet. So it's, you know, it's kind of like a definer in boundaries between realms to an extent as well. So this is a time, like I said, of when you're going through your first one, adulting. And it certainly makes you take responsibility for things, especially think about, you know, if you're in your late 20s right now and going through your Saturn return, I'm sure you have a really good idea right now of what this experience is all about. If you're not 27 yet, going into your Saturn return, having an idea of your chart is a really good thing. Things I wish I would have known, as I said, would have been way more helpful. But obviously there's a reason for that. So, and then if you're past your Saturn return, then it's a good time for reflection, especially if you're in your 40s, being in the midst of a Uranus opposition like I am. It's a really good time to go back to the experience and find the things that are maybe unhealed or are coming back up. These things work in cycles, but the flavor of them is different because we're talking about different planets. But one of the really cool things about Saturn is it just makes us face things in a mature way. So when we're talking about the moon, we're talking about our emotions and our sense of safety and security and our inner world. So when Saturn contacts the moon in particular, it brings a hefty dose of reality to those things. A lot of times too, when we have Saturn and moon contacts, whether you have that natally or it's happening by transit, it can involve things that are really deep with your mom, which I'll talk about, and this happened for me. So Saturn, moon, mom relationships also come into play in the maturity of those, the relationship to your own mother, or even how you mother yourself. That was a little bit of my experience too. So this is the description from the software that I use, which is SolarFire. And this is what SolarFire says about Sade Sati. This can be a lonely time when you feel cut off from loved ones and particularly self-critical. Moon in Virgo, I can tell you, yes, that's a big part of my experience. Circumstances are such that you cannot seek comfort in your usual way. This therefore throws you back onto your own resources. You may experience rejection from someone close at a time when you feel a strong need for security. However, it is likely that you have contributed to this rejection, unknowingly creating time for introspection. It is important not to judge yourself or others harshly during this transit, and to remember that the outcome is self-growth and a firmer understanding of your strengths and weaknesses. And that is so spot on. If you've gone through Sade Sati, I think that will resonate deeply with you. If you went through Sade Sati and your Saturn return concurrently, I think that will really, really resonate with you as it does with me. So resources, I'll put the link in the show notes. The Astrology podcast, Chris Brennan did an excellent episode about Sade Sati on there. So you can search for that wherever you listen to podcasts. It's also on his website. And then there's a book. It's more of a mythic tale, I guess you could say, about Sade Sati and Saturn in general. The book is called The Greatness of Saturn. And that is a really good resource. And it's very interesting because there's different perspectives on Sade Sati depending on what type of astrology you're really into. So that's more of a Vedic astrology perspective, and Sade Sati is said to be like a very unfortunate time, and it's called your 7.5, I think is how they refer to it in the book. Really, really interesting. If you want to read more about that, that's a good resource. So my experience, like I said, Saturn was transiting. So for me, return and Sade Sati, house 4, which is home and family and ancestry to an extent. It can relate to our physical home, land that we live on. It definitely relates to our comfort zone to an extent and our private life. And one of the less talked about themes of the 4th house is authentic self. So like I said, I have my North Node there. So this whole transit involved Saturn going through my 4th, transiting my North Node. And then 5th is your creativity, your connection to your muse. It's joy, it's passion. It's really, quote unquote, the house of fun. So lots of opportunities in the 5th house for birthing things into the world. It can also relate to children, and that can be actual children or creative things that you birth into the world. For me, it's more of that flavor. And like I said, I have Venus there, although I have Venus in Virgo, which is not a favorite sign of hers. Venus is said to be in its planetary joy in the 5th house because Venus just wants to connect and have fun. So even though I had Saturn going over my Venus during this experience, I think that some of the lessons that came from it were just lessening control, surrendering, and just learning how to have fun and experience pleasure and not feel guilty about it. And then 6th house is our health. So house 1, like we talked about, I have Chiron there, which is the reason behind this entire project that I'm doing here. So 1 is our physical body. It's how we work through the world. It's how we show up in the world. It's how other people see us. 6 is the maintenance of the body. So 6 relates to our daily practices, our day-to-day, like in a work sense to an extent as well. It can relate to having an affinity for small pets, which is one of the lesser known themes of the 6th house, but it's habits, it's routine, it's health. The 5 is like the house of fun, and 6 is like not the most fun house, but we have to do things on a daily basis to keep these vessels healthy and running, and so we can do our work in the outside world. So it's a very important spot. And one of the other things too, that's really important to mention is the highest expression of the 6th house is being of service. And I can totally speak to that, having my sun there, having Saturn there, and Pluto there. So it can also relate to health conditions. So we can talk a little bit about that as well in this share. So that's where it was happening for me. I did go back and look at the transits that were happening during this time. I mean, just knowing that I was going through Sade Sati and Saturn Return, like I had an idea of, where things were, what was happening, just knowing what I know now and being a professional astrologer. However, I had never gone back and actually looked at what else was happening in my chart. So I spent a good amount of time doing that yesterday, and it's really, really interesting. And some of the things are just like, oh my God, aha, I can't believe that was actually part of the experience as well. Some of these things are things that not everybody gets to go through. So I'm just going to kind of tell the story. I have an outline here. I'm going to do my best. This was a very challenging time of my life, and going back, thinking about recording this episode has just brought up a lot. But that's the Chiron part, right? That's the healing journey, and that's the alchemy in it, and that's letting things come to the surface so they can be healed. That's part of the point. It's part of why we tell our stories, because I'm sure that there's got to be at least one other person out there that's had a similar experience. So this all really started for me. I'd say I talked about this when I did my 3-part series on discovering your soul's calling, and I talked about my journey of going to college and work and all that. So I'd say that this started percolating in the end of 2004, which is when I stepped out of my role at the vet's office and shifted into a 9-to-5 career. During this time, I've alluded to this in a couple other shows, I'm sure. I was in a serious relationship with somebody. I'm not with that person anymore. That's part of this. So I just graduated college. I was doing the two-year certificate program at the local school that I mentioned. And I was with my ex-fiance at the time. We got together when I think it was my junior year in college. So we've been together for several years at this point. We were living together. I had moved out of my parents' house when we got together, pretty much. So outside of living in the dorm or apartment, campus housing, I was living in an apartment with him. And shifting careers, I look back at this time, and lo and behold, I had Neptune transiting my 10th house. So Neptune was in the sign of Aquarius during this entire time. So having this sense of disillusion and confusion and not being able to really find my way was all part of it. And then now knowing that that was Neptune also going through my 10th and transiting my South node, which is really important. Not everyone gets to go through that. So that was a part of it. Also, Chiron was in Aquarius during this time too. So Chiron was also transiting my 10th house and my South. Interesting, to say the least, going back and looking. So I start my first position in the summer of 2005, the engineering company I talked about. I'm pretty sure at this point I had moved a lot. When Saturn started transiting my 4th, that can happen, finding home or, disruptions in the home, moving, that kind of thing. That can happen when Saturn transits your 4th. So at this point, I believe we were one apartment away from the one that we lived in the longest. And that was like one of the few stable things in my life, was actually having a stable living environment to an extent, just bare bones structure wise. Inside the home was not, and we'll talk about that. But so having a steady job, 9-to-5, set schedule was nice, not having to work weekends. The vet's office was just crazy, and I ended up working 40 to 60 hours some weeks because it was just a very busy office, and we handled emergencies, and I worked on weekends, and it was a stressful time. So getting the engineering company, like I said, things are pretty stable there, which is really nice. Summer 2005, things are going fairly well. And things start clicking into place transit-wise as I went back and looked. So what I saw, what I had during this time was Pluto was squaring my moon. So I was born with Pluto in Libra at 21 degrees, really close to my sun. It had transited the rest of my 6th and my 7th throughout my childhood. And then we get to the point of my 20s, and Pluto goes into my 8th house. And not only is it going into my 8th house, it's squaring my moon and transiting Neptune, my Neptune natally. I have Neptune at 20 degrees of Sagittarius natally. So I have a really intense moon Neptune square. And Pluto gave it a very healthy dose of what Pluto does, which is transformation that comes from situations that feel like, as they say, la petite mort, little deaths. So very interesting looking back on this, because one of the things that really started this whole experience, talking about the moon, is my mom was diagnosed with cancer in October of 2006. So Pluto squaring my moon, Saturn transiting my 4th, so things with home and family and security and, the mother, all these things came up during this time. Like I said, Saturn was going through my 4th at this time. And then I also noticed, besides Neptune and Chiron both transiting my 10th, was the nodes were in Virgo and Pisces. So I was also experiencing eclipses on my moon and my natal planets in Virgo. To say that was all super intense it's an understatement. It's a total understatement. And the other thing that was happening, as planets go through the 10th house of the chart, they square your 1st and your 7th. So, like I've talked about several times, squares create threshold experiences, and facing death is very much a threshold experience. Death of a parent brings up a lot with a cancer diagnosis. If you're out there listening and you've had a similar experience, then I'm sure you can relate and understand. And part of this experience was me being, there's 4 children in my family. 2 of them one's on the West Coast, one's in another state on the East Coast. So it was pretty much me and my youngest sister that were here during that time to help and be here throughout that whole experience with my mom. So it rattled all of us to the core. Thankfully, she came through it okay after many rounds of chemo and radiation and surgeries, the whole Western medicine poison cut burn process. So that was a huge part of this whole experience for me. And when I talk about Sade Sati being a very long experience of emotional maturity, when you are put in that situation, you really start to have a different perspective on life in general and what you're doing with your own. And there's been a lot of death in my family, but this one was different, obviously. So just seeing someone go through that and what comes up in the shared experience as well was really interesting and challenging. But I could say that on this side of it, and also looking back, I didn't really get the whole emotional maturity part of it down very well going through the experience, because another big part of this for me was learning how to fill my own cup and learning how to put myself first. Like I said, having a Libra sun, generally the tendency is to put others first and to people please. And that's totally what I did. I just buried my own emotions and did not handle it at all. And wanted to be the one that was strong and tough. You know how we're conditioned to be that way. So that's the role I took on in all this. I took on the role of caretaker, stabilizer, and the rock. So there are times to this day that I cannot handle talking about Cancer, let alone seeing someone go through it or know that someone has a shared experience. It's just hard. So that is part of my healing journey in all this. And important, to say the least, especially looking back on it now, going through everything that I've already shared and talked about. It's a big deal. It's a really big deal. And having Chiron in the first, I know that that was a huge part of it, is this, you know, facing this as part of my own healing journey. One of the things that is beneficial is as Chiron then moved on and into my fifth, because it's Virgo for me. I'm not Chiron, I'm sorry, Saturn. It was trining my Chiron and trining my midheaven, which is 24 degrees Capricorn. So learning to see the practical nature and the reality of the situation and calling in all the things that Earth represents, the stability, was also part of the experience, kind of on the flip side, once all the, you know, traumatic things were kind of over. So that was the start of it. Not surprising. And especially with Pluto squaring my moon, that was a big revelation when I looked at the transits and saw that, especially in the eighth house. The eighth house relates to death to a big extent. It relates to how we transform, and having that be a huge part of this experience for me was, you know, part of my soul's journey, of course, as all of this is. So during this time, I was also, like I said, sixth house is our health. So I'm going to talk about this other piece of this eventually, but I was also going through an incredible journey in learning how to heal my own body. There are genetic things that I know and am aware of that, quote unquote, run in the family, like high cholesterol and heart attacks and obviously cancer. So just learning how to eat properly. And I had a huge weight loss journey as part of this whole experience for me as well, which is really interesting looking back, knowing, you know, now that Saturn's in my first and Saturn's in my sixth at 1 degree of Libra, and having this be like a big health journey for me as well. Like when you see someone go through cancer, it really starts to show you things about the reality, bringing in that Saturn word, of our diets and our food and how we take care of ourselves, and just going more to the Eastern side to an extent of how we can heal naturally rather than taking the Western approach of poison, cut, burn, and prescription drugs and that kind of thing. So those things were a huge part of this experience for me as well. I got really into my physical fitness. I was exercising a ton. There was a tremendous amount of shedding involved physically for me, and really making my own health a priority. Having my mom go through this showed me and taught me a lot. And also a huge part of the healing journey for me with this, you know, my sixth house being involved in this whole experience as well. So that was kind of like a concurrent peripheral thing that was happening. That wasn't like a boom, like, you know, the cancer diagnosis or anything like that, but just to touch on some of the things that were also happening. This was a very multi-layered experience for me. So we had that kind of going on as well, fitness and all of that, and taking care of my own body and getting myself healthy. And I will definitely go more into that in another episode. And then this is about, we're talking like 2 years into this whole thing now. Mom's getting better. The whole experience is kind of coming to a close. During this time, I believe Saturn has come into my fifth at this point. Yes, Saturn has come into my fifth at this point, so it's transited my Venus, so bringing the relationship part back into this discussion. This was when I talked last episode about Eat, Pray, Love. I referenced the part in the beginning when she's realizing that she doesn't want to be in this marriage anymore, and she's talking about her feelings and looking around and saying that the only thing that was more impossible than staying was leaving. And I can totally relate to that. She says she doesn't want to hurt anybody. She just wants to disappear into the night. And I can say that that was definitely part of my experience in the relationship that I was in at this time. Wasn't a bad guy, just like in the movie, not a bad guy. Big heart. I loved him deeply. And a lot of the reasons why were some of the things that are shown about Steven's personality in the movie. Like, he was just different and off the cuff and was not my typical taste or choice. But those things ended up kind of biting me in the ass in the end, because that translated a lot to things like jobs and finances and commitment in a relationship that you just expect someone to be your equal partner. So during all of this, thankfully, I did finally have the stability in my job. So I didn't have to worry too much about finances, as I was the breadwinner in, quote unquote, the breadwinner in that relationship. I paid for mostly everything. And that was challenging. He'd had many different jobs. There was never any security there for me financially coming from him. So having the reality of the relationship as Saturn's transiting my Venus come into play at this point was a huge part of the experience as well. And as it's nearing my moon, now that Saturn's in Virgo, having all that safety and security stuff come up that relates to the moon, financial, was I happy? That also came up a lot, because obviously this is Saturn's going through my fifth at this point, and like I said, it's the house of fun and joy. And I had moments of feeling happy, but overall, definitely not. And there were many times that I almost left, but I didn't. So this comes into play now, giving a little bit of background on that experience, as the next big boom that came was in August of 2008. You all can kind of, if you're old enough, look back and reflect and remember what was going on in 2008. And I got laid off from my job. I was there for about 3 years at that point, and I was a casualty of the recession. And I look back at the transits that were happening at that point, and one of the things that happens as part of our Saturn return experience is what's called our nodal opposition. So the nodes come into, they're flipped. So the north node by transit goes over your south node, and the south node by transit goes over your north node. And like I said, mine are 10 and 4. So this calls into play all the themes: home, family, living situation, private life, and career space, and work in the outside world. So I got laid off in early August of 2008. And I just happened to discover, going back to the transits at that point in time, that it was my nodal opposition. It was like almost exact. I think the nodes were at like 18 degrees of Leo and Aquarius, but flipped. Like I said, mine are at 17. I had Chiron transiting my south node at that point in time. So some kind of healing experience, like wrapping up an old story. South node relates very much to our previous experiences on a soul level that we come into this lifetime with. And having this happen was an incredible healing journey, although it was incredibly stressful. Like, what do I do about money and finances and going on unemployment for the first time in my entire life when I'm the one paying for everything? And it was jarring. I was not surprised when it happened. I was actually surprised that it happened so much later as it did, because there were other people that were laid off in the office before me. So very, very stressful. I also realized when I went back to look through the transits that Jupiter was squaring my sun. So Jupiter was in Capricorn at this time, going through my 9th house. So, bringing attention and expansion, shifting beliefs to an extent was a whole part of this experience. Uranus was opposing my moon. So Uranus was in Pisces at this time. And that was, surprise, surprise, your whole life is shaken up. Your safety and security and comfort zone are gone. So that being part of the experience was interesting. And Mars was actually on my moon during this time too. So I had Saturn going through my 5th, and when this happened, Mars was on my moon. Really, really interesting transits to look at. So that happened. I took it on the nose and did what I could, went on unemployment, searched for other jobs, and thankfully I was really only quote unquote unemployed for a month. So I just had fun with it. I went to the gym almost every day. Like I said, this whole journey was also coupled with a fitness and a healing journey of my body. So I just did what I wanted for the first time in probably ever, every day, which was nice. But, still looking and updating my resume and looking for jobs and handling that part of the experience as well. So after a month went by, early September, I had found another job. Unfortunately, it was like an hour away. And that ended up, I think I talked about this when I talked about my career path. Not a very fun place to work, and I was not happy there at all, but it served its purpose. So that was part of this as well. And then Saturn's coming closer and closer to my natal moon at this point, going through Virgo. In November of 2008, my maternal grandmother passed away. So death in the maternal family line, again, coming back up, was, part of this experience. That was sad, but it wasn't surprising. She was in a nursing home and suffering from dementia, and, expecting these things to happen doesn't make the experience any easier, but that was part of it as well. And then just having see my mom go through that as well, on the tail end of her cancer journey was, man, it was messed up, but part of it. So all this happening. And then the other thing too, with when I got laid off, my partner did not step up. And that showed me a lot. I was criticized and not treated the way that I expected to be treated with everything that I'd given to that relationship. So I had more fuel at this point in facing the reality of my relationship. And then in November, so that happened in November of 2008. In February of 2009, I'd finally had enough and I left. I left my ex. We were engaged as well. So I left my ex-fiance in February of 2009. And going back and looking at those transits, Saturn was at 20 degrees of Virgo, retrograde on my moon. And I'm pretty sure I had almost left when Saturn had first hit my moon. So that was like a 3-part experience. a lot of the times with these things, we get 3 passes. The planet goes in direct, quote unquote, direct motion over the natal planet, and then it goes retrograde, and then it goes back. So it's like multiple chapters to the whole story in the story of this entire 7.5-year experience for me. So I made the decision. I finally did it. I moved back in with my parents in the house that I grew up in. And I look back to more detailed transits, and there's a huge amount going on in Aquarius at this time. It was February. So there was a lot of activity in my 10th house, a lot of things passing over my south node. So more releasing, more healing, more soul's lesson type experiences. Yeah, so that breakup was a big part of it. And just like in Eat, Pray, Love, she said she doesn't want to hurt anybody. And I just did, that's what kept me in the relationship way longer than I should have stayed, because I just didn't want to hurt anybody. And like I said, putting yourself first in this whole thing is really, putting yourself first in general is really difficult, especially when you're a fucking Libra. So putting myself first and honoring my own feelings and getting myself out of that situation for myself, knowing the catastrophe that I was going to leave behind, was really, really challenging. But I did it. I had 2 cats with him. I left them as well. I could not bring them to my parents' house. I think at this point they had like 5 cats. So that was a huge part of this experience. And then just being alone for a little while was nice. Not having that responsibility and heaviness all the time. I was able to get back on my feet financially. I paid off a lot of debt moving back into my parents' house. Thankfully, they didn't charge me rent or anything. So I had a lot of time. I had my own room for the first time, I think, ever. And that was an incredibly challenging but beautiful healing journey in that breakup and that experience. And then one of the other things that was happening during this time was I not met, but reconnected with my current husband. So relationships coming into play makes total sense. Facing the reality of things makes total sense. Taking action and responsibility makes total sense when we're talking about Saturn, like I said in the beginning, being part of this experience, and then also having the whole emotional element as well, with my moon being involved the entire time. So that was my relationship and breakup that was part of this as well. It was very much like a divorce. You can imagine you're living with somebody, you have everything shared. I moved into one room, so I could not bring all the things that I had. Like, detaching from stuff was a big part of the experience too. I could not bring all the furniture that I picked out and bought and loved, and just, I had a little bit of storage space thanks to a cousin. So there were some things that I was able to bring with me that I did not want to leave behind, that I did not have space for in my parents' house. So it was a huge unraveling, but totally honoring all of what I could in the experience, that all the experiences with the job and my mom and my grandmom and all the things that had happened leading into this experience. So then we're kind of like, now we're inching along into my actual exact Saturn return. So there was all the heavy things that happened. But then as my Saturn return really started inching closer, as Saturn started getting closer and closer to 1 degree of Libra, things really started looking up. And like I said, this happened in my 6th house. Saturn's at 1 degree Libra in my 6th. So my work changed again. I had really did not like where I was working, that second job that I got after I got laid off, and an opportunity arose. And it just so happened, I look back to the exact dates that Saturn was at 1 degree of Libra, and Saturn, my first Saturn return happened the day after I started a new job at the place that I was in until I recently left a year ago. So that was really interesting looking back at that being part of the experience, and just that synchronicity and the timing was just like, wow, I cannot believe that the divine timing behind all this is super, super interesting as well, just in the dates. So that was November 17th of 2009 when Saturn first returned to 1 degree of Libra for me. And then my experience continued. Like I said, this is usually like a 3-part, especially with Saturn, because Saturn moves so slowly. My actual Saturn return was November of 2009 until August of 2010, pretty much. So during that time, I moved again. So I went back in with my parents. I changed jobs again. I was still very focused on my health and fitness and exercise and all that. But then I started a new relationship. This being, Saturn and Libra, relationships coming into play here. So I was in a new relationship with the man that I'm currently married to. So all these positive shifts kind of on the other side of the Sade Sati experiences. And starting that new relationship when I was still kind of, when you have a breakup, it's like a death. Like, again, Pluto was definitely involved in all of this for me. Pluto was squaring my Saturn at this point. When Pluto moved into Capricorn in 2008, it squared my Saturn. So Capricorn squares Libra. So having Pluto involved in all of this heavily, you can't avoid that. I've got, Pluto pretty much in a wide orb conjunct to my sun. So like I said, sun at 13 Libra, Pluto at 21. So having this undertone of this whole plutonic experience and this transformation and little deaths along the way, that experiences that feel like death, that bring about change and transformation on a soul level, all part of this experience. Things started getting more positive, I guess I can say. Not easier, because it was still challenging, all that change all at once. But, moving into things that were better as I started honoring myself. Part of this experience was Saturn going over my sun. Part of this experience, I believe I touched on before, was Pluto squaring my sun. So my sun's getting a lot of action at this point too, because it's also in the 6th house in Libra. And that just being, the first time that I really honored myself, truly honored myself, and left jobs because it was a better opportunity for me and would make me happier to do something else. As you know, I've talked about, I'm a Taurus rising, and change is not an easy thing for Taurus in general, but especially when you're a Taurus rising. Comfort is huge. And I would stay in situations because they were just comfortable, and I didn't like change, even if I wasn't happy. And that related to my relationship and to my job at that point in time. So that all being a huge part of this too, underlying themes, concurrent themes. Like I said, it's a very multifaceted, multi-layered experience that I've had. And just, I think this is a really good example of our Saturn work. When I'm working with people and we're talking about Saturn transits and things like that, things that relate to Saturn, I always say that the lessons really feel like being called into the principal's office. What did I do? Oh no, I'm in trouble. You get all red in the face. But those types of things help you develop and honor your sense of personal authority to an extent, or own up to something that maybe you did wrong, or apologize for something, or punishment fitting the crime, quote unquote, like as an analogy. So being forced in a way by just life situations to change or to make a move where you wouldn't have done it on your own because you wanted to stay comfortable, that being part of the experience. I want to read this Sade Sati part again, because this comes back into play now in particular. And this whole thing too with my ex, it didn't involve my family a lot, because a lot of people that I was close to, family included, and some friends, just did not like him. And I had to deal with that too. And there was something that happened at my sister's wedding, which also happened during this time in June of 2008, that um, separated me from my family for a little while because of my ex. And having to choose between my fiance and my family was a part of this experience. So I want to read this part again. There's some parts of the story that I've omitted on purpose. The self-esteem part that I touched on earlier, that was a huge part of this as well. I mean, yeah, we're talking about the sun, for me in particular in this experience, in Venus, and my self-esteem was in the toilet for a lot of this time. So honoring that and healing that and learning and growing into my own in those ways as well, and my confidence coming into play as part of this too, was a very big part of this experience. So I'm going to read this again, just as kind of like we're getting to the end of the story now, so end cap. This can be a lonely time when you feel cut off from loved ones and particularly self-critical. Circumstances are such that you cannot seek comfort in your usual way. This, therefore, throws you back onto your own resources. You may experience rejection from someone close at a time when you feel a strong need for security. However, it is likely that you have contributed to this rejection, unknowingly creating time for introspection. It is important not to judge yourself or others harshly during this transit, and to remember that the outcome is self-growth and a firmer understanding of your strengths and weaknesses. So tie that in a knot and put a bow on it, because I can tell you from my experience that I've just shared, that's so true. So true. So if you are in the midst of a Sade Sati experience, in the midst of a Saturn return experience, and I'm talking if you have an Aquarius moon or you have Saturn in Aquarius, these are important things to remember. If you have had your first Saturn return, it's a good, reflect on it a little bit. If you're familiar with astrology, even better, because you can go back and look and see what was happening at that time. If you are like me, around the age of 40, on the brink of or in the midst of your Uranus opposition, Saturn comes into play here as well, because it's a good time, like I said, to reflect back on that time of your life and what was going on and what's coming up now. For me, what's coming up now, as I shared in the last episode, is just honoring who I truly am and being independent and doing my own thing and just completely getting out of my comfort zone. I stayed in the comfort zone a little bit during the Saturn return experience. I can honestly say that, but so that's kind of what's coming up for me again. And then also too, and just sharing all of this and the healing of, those emotions that were buried for so long, and that all coming up prior to and during, this share is a big part of it too. It's not good to bury your feelings. It's the best thing to emote in a healthy way. And what can teach us how to do that in our charts is our moons. So for me, having my moon in Virgo, having diving into my health, having that be a big part of this experience is interesting, to say the least, because it's so relevant to what that means, and not being self-critical and judgmental and all of those things that can come with, and not having things perfect. That was a huge lesson too, since, as I said, I have 3 planets in Virgo. So having Saturn kind of go through, I talk about this experience, and I work with people that have had similar experiences, and I say that I had a rough draft version of my life, and Saturn came along and just put that right in the shredder because that's where it belonged, because I wasn't truly honoring me. And then, as I've said, my spiritual reawakening experience and all that really have just brought me back to myself. And part of the Uranus opposition for me, since I've said I have my North Node in Leo, is Saturn opposing it. And Uranus is squaring it. So Uranus is squaring my nodes right now, and it has been. And that's been a huge part of this. Whenever we have something squaring the nodes, like I said, I have Chiron natally squaring my nodes. It's a repeating lesson. It's with Leo, it's always just coming back to your heart. And what does your heart want? And having that be a huge part of this experience for me over and over and over is what I, incarnated with. These are the lessons. Those are the lessons. On a soul level, we deal with these things when Saturn comes along, especially. And Pluto, like I said, Pluto was very heavily involved in this for me. So that is, I had a page of notes and I've pretty much gotten through them. And I felt that this was, again, divinely guided, spiritually guided. Mercury, like I said, is in Virgo right now, and it just so happens to be at 20 degrees of Virgo right now. So as I'm sharing this story with you on Wednesday, Mercury's day, Mercury is also transiting my natal moon to the degree. So I'll just leave that there. It always boggles my mind, but it's such a beautiful thing, all this synchronicity and divinity and divine timing behind everything. So that was my Sade Sati, Saturn return, concurrent experience. Again, very much amplified. Like my Uranus opposition is now, like I've shared. So I'm going to end this episode here. I think this is pretty much the longest one I've done. We're a little over an hour at this point. So just to remind everybody, I am at ursaalchemy.com. I am at seagoddesshealingarts.com. If you want to work with me, all of my services are there on the Sea Goddess website. I thank you for listening. If you're out there, you've had a similar experience to anything that I've shared so far, I'd love to hear from you. The Chiron part really came in heavy with this share that I had today, especially. And then the other interesting part of the experience too was Saturn was Chiron's dad. So just another part of things that can come up. Like I said, when we have Saturn moon transits, Pluto moon transits, Saturn sun can usually involve dad. So all those things for you to explore. And like I said, I'll put the link to the astrology podcast episode about Sade Sati in the show notes. So I will be back with you again shortly after the next new moon, by the end of the month, probably. And we'll do another astro weather check and talk about all the things that we'll have and offerings that can help guide you through the upcoming Mercury retrograde, the Mars retrograde, and the things that are coming in at the end of the year. If you are local in the South Jersey area, we have our final farmers market at the Absecon Lighthouse on Tuesday, next Tuesday, the 23rd at 4 p.m. is when it starts. It's 4 to 7. So if you want to join us for that, that would be awesome. We have a lineup of wonderful vendors, and you can find all that information on our socials, Sade Healing Arts and SadeHealingarts.com. And I will get this episode posted soon, and hope to hear from you if you shared something similar to my experience in all this. And like I say at the end of every episode, remember to be a maverick. Bye.